In the mid-90s, the video game industry stood at the threshold of a revolution. The shift from 2D to 3D graphics was reshaping how games were made, played and experienced. Many players like Sony and Nintendo were gearing up for this new era, and Sega, a company deeply ingrained in both the arcade and home console gaming scene, was ready to compete with its next big leap, the Sega Saturn. But the Sega Saturn's journey wasn't easy. Releasing in 1994, it was Sega's most ambitious system yet, and now, 30 years later, we're going to look back at the development, challenges and legacy of this fascinating console. In the early 1990s, Sega had found major success with the 16-bit Genesis or Mega Drive console, depending on where you were in the world. But change was on the horizon, as 3D graphics were exploding in popularity in arcades, and Sega saw an opportunity to bring that same experience to the living room. When we talk about legendary consoles, the Saturn doesn't always come up first, but for many gamers, it holds a special place in their hearts. The Saturn didn't just bring something new to the table, it carved its own path in the gaming world with an interesting mix of groundbreaking and legendary titles that would influence many future genres in the games industry. Yet the Saturn is still seen as an underrated console, but it has a lot of plus points, which we will now look at. Released in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in North America, the Saturn was Sega's bold entry into the 32-bit era, going head-to-head with the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64. The Saturn featured an interesting hardware architecture, which was both its strength and its weakness. It was incredibly powerful for 2D games, allowing for beautiful sprite-based visuals that really pushed the limits of what games could do at the time. Led by Hideki Sato, Sega's engineers designed the Saturn to handle these new 3D graphics, but the solution they landed on was complicated. With dual CPUs, multiple processors, it was powerful, sure, but it was also incredibly hard to program for. Despite the technical hurdles, the Saturn made its debut in Japan on November 22nd, 1994, and the reception? It was good, really good. Titles like Virtua Fighter were smash hits, driving early sales. Later games like Radiant Silvergun and Street Fighter Alpha 3, along with the many arcade fighters it housed, still look stunning even to this day. The system could handle loads of sprites on screen with almost no slowdown, making it a go-to platform for arcade ports. In a lot of ways, the Saturn was ahead of its time in how it handled 2D games. If you were a fan of classic arcade titles, this was the console to have. Its ability to render complex backgrounds and layers of sprites was unmatched, something you couldn't get from the PlayStation or even the Nintendo 64. Even to this day, it is still seen as the best platform to play arcade ports of 2D fighters, even with modern technology, which often struggles to replicate the unique qualities of the Saturn's arcade capabilities. One of the issues would arise in Sega thinking that 2D games would still hold strong for another few years due to the previous success of the Mega Drive Genesis. But trends were quickly shifting, with consumers looking for new and more exciting ways to play games, which saw 3D become the new innovation within the industry. This left Sega falling behind almost instantly, as the console architecture made it difficult to develop quality 3D games quickly. But really, they underestimated the market and their competitors, thinking that they had the playground to themselves to become the dominant force into the new games generation, which they could very well have done until they found out about the development of Sony's new PlayStation console, which focused more on 3D elements and was easier to develop for, which only left Sega in a bit of a panic. Now, while the Saturn was a beast for 2D gaming, it was also home to some standout 3D games, with Panzer Dragoon, Nights into Dreams, Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally, Die Hard Arcade, The House of the Dead, and Burning Rangers showed that the Saturn could also deliver immersive, innovative 3D experiences. Nights into Dreams in particular was groundbreaking. Its fluid controls and movement systems made it a joy to fly around the game's environments, and the use of the analog 3D controller made for a more interactive and memorable experience, further proving the Saturn's capabilities as a powerful console in the games market. The Saturn's 3D capabilities weren't as refined as that of the PlayStation, but what it did with style. Games like Nights into Dreams gave players a real sense of freedom, while Panzer Dragoon provided epic on-rail shooting action with a unique artistic flair. These games felt very different, and that's what made the Saturn stand out in its own way. Another thing that made the Saturn stand out was its commitment to the near arcade perfect experiences at home. Sega's legacy as an arcade giant was clear in its titles for the system. If you loved the arcade, this console was like bringing the experience straight into your living room. Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally Championship were shining examples of this, being among the best games in their specific genres for quite some time, with Sega Rally becoming one of the most influential rally games ever that would spawn a sea of racing clones, even helping to change the entire landscape of the rally simulation worlds we see in games today. The Saturn would also be among the first ever consoles to introduce online play in the 90s with its Netlink service, making it a revolutionary factor in technology at the time. While online play was still in its infancy, the Saturn was a pioneer in this area, giving players the chance to battle each other over dial-up connections, something that paved the way for the online gaming world that we know today. Of course, we can't forget about the Sega Saturn's Japanese library, which has some of the most interesting and diverse lineup of games ever. While some of these gems didn't make it into the West, games like Grandia, Shining Force 3 and Dragon Force gave the system a rich, diverse library of RPGs, strategy games and more that were beloved by fans. Even today, the Saturn's import library is highly sought after by collectors. Many of these games, along with classic Mega Drive titles, would later be released under the Sega Ages catalogue in Japan for the PlayStation 2 during the mid-2000s, with upscale visuals and extra features, with some games having fully remastered visuals and gameplay being completely developed in 3D. The Sega Saturn might not have won the console wars, but it left a lasting legacy. It was a machine built for gamers who appreciated cutting-edge arcade experiences, beautiful 2D artistry and creative 3D design. Its uniqueness is what makes it stand out, and even today, it has a dedicated fan base that continues to celebrate its quirks and innovations. The Saturn would see decent success in Japan during the first few months of its launch, but in North America things didn't go as smoothly. At the first ever Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3 in 1995, Sega would make a bold move, announcing that the Saturn would launch that very day. Surprise launches sound exciting, but this caught both retailers and game developers off guard. With limited stock and very few launch titles available, the reception wasn't what Sega had hoped for. To make matters worse, Sony was waiting in the wings with the PlayStation, a system that was easier for developers to work with, and it launched with a more calculated marketing strategy. The PlayStation would also retail at a cheaper price, instantly leaving Sega looking like a laughingstock in front of thousands of fans and spectators. These decisions would strain many relationships with Sega among retailers, with many refusing to sell the console due to a lack of information around the sudden launch, with also not having enough time to prepare in advance. Sony's PlayStation stole the spotlight, and Sega was left playing catch up from the very start. The sudden launch announcement was a panic move from Sega, as once they've gotten wind of the increasing popularity of the PlayStation in Japan, they instantly wanted to get a foot in the door, thinking that they could beat their competitors to achieve global sales and profits. But due to the complicated development structure of the Saturn, creating games was no easy task, and would greatly impact the launch, while having games available with Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA and Panzer Dragoon, which would be standout features of this list. The other games were Clockwork Knight, Pebble Beach Golf Links and Worldwide Soccer, Sega International Victory Gold Edition, didn't have the same appeal. Whereas when the PlayStation eventually launched, it was presented with almost instant hits that would quickly help increase its popularity status among buyers and players in the console market. The Saturn's hardware was no doubt its Achilles heel. Game development was time consuming and difficult, with many third-party developers struggling, leaving the Saturn with fewer titles compared to its competitors. Another challenge would be Sega's own vision for the future of gaming. They believed that 2D games would remain dominant for a while longer, and invested heavily in that direction. But as we know, the industry shifted rapidly towards 3D experiences, leaving the Saturn's 2D strengths in the dust. But while many would question these ideas, the Saturn is still, even to this day, the best platform to play 2D games, with plenty of near-perfect arcade ports. Where the Saturn would excel in these areas, other competitors, even with the PlayStation, would struggle, as the PS1 would be mainly better with 3D concepts, but it didn't have the same qualities regarding 2D visuals, although while decent, just couldn't match the Saturn's superiority in that department. Over the years, the Saturn's architecture would prove difficult, even for emulation purposes, with fans looking to preserve its impressive yet interesting back catalogue of titles, making it difficult to run certain games, with many not working at all until recent years, where emulation has greatly improved. With the prices of collecting for the console at an all-time high, being among the most expensive yet lucrative in the retro gaming space, then emulation may be the best alternative to play the many great games on the console. So where does that leave the Sega Saturn? Was it a failure? Commercially, yes, but in other ways the Saturn was ahead of its time, with its use of online technology, amazing collection of arcade ports, which left an enduring legacy with many games like Nights into Dreams, Panzer Dragoon Saga and Shining Force 3 are still beloved by fans to this very day. There are a lot of positives to take from the Sega Saturn, as when we look back, it is often known for the marketing mishaps of its launch period, but honestly it's an excellent system with some of the greatest games ever made, which also paved the way for Sega's next console, the Dreamcast. Although the Dreamcast marked Sega's exit from the hardware business, it also became a fan favourite and, like the Saturn, left a lasting impact on the industry, being fondly remembered even to the current day. And perhaps more importantly, the Saturn's story serves as a cautionary tale. It's a reminder of how crucial it is to balance ambition with practicality. You need to have developer support, clear marketing strategies, and a solid understanding of where the market is headed. Sega learned these lessons the hard way. While the PlayStation was ahead of the competition in terms of sales and with a larger selection of games, the Saturn had a lot going for it during the 90s console generation, as it was the go-to place for near-perfect ports of arcade titles and 2D fighters with clean, crisp and visually stunning graphics that are still on par with the best of what we now see on modern systems, and yet is still considered as the best platform to play many of these games, even in modern times. As while the console was difficult to develop for, its architecture was more focused on arcade elements, which made most game conversions almost seamless with graphics, gameplay and speed, rarely suffering from any slowdown, making them fun, frantic and competitive for hardcore players in the current day. All you have to do is look at the library of titles from the Marvel vs Capcom and Street Fighter series to see the level of detail and playability they provide. If your only goal is to collect and play 2D arcade fighters, then the Saturn is the best place to flex those fighting moves. The Saturn, like the PlayStation, is also home to some of the greatest role-playing RPG games ever made, with this generation still often considered as the greatest era for the evolution of the genre, that is home to an incredible lineup of titles, with many of them only releasing in Japan, very like the PlayStation, having loads of games that are still rare and unknown to many. The console presents a great mix of both 2D and 3D experiences, even mixing elements of the two styles, with massive titles like Shining Force 3, Dark Savior, and Shining the Holy Ark, to name but a few. The 2D RPG games also stand out, very like arcade fighters and 2D shoot 'em ups, with stunning visuals, being seen as some of the greatest ever on any console, making it a great alternative to the PlayStation's massive RPG catalogue for more iconic and interesting games. The Sega Saturn may not have been a commercial success, but it had a remarkable lineup of games, many of which have become cult classics, with some being considered as the best games ever made, which we will now look at here. A masterpiece of arcade action and gameplay, the Panzer Dragoon series is often cited as one of the best fantasy rail shooter series of all time. Its fusion of traditional RPG mechanics with real-time combat, set in a richly atmospheric world, was a groundbreaking experience, and the rarity of physical copies have only added to its legendary status, which are among some of the most expensive that you can find in the retro gaming space. Nights into Dreams was one of the most visually and creatively ambitious titles on the Saturn. Its dreamy, surreal world combined with fast-paced aerial gameplay made it a standout feature. The game's unique control system, especially when used with the 3D controller, elevated it even further to become one of the most adored games of its style within the games industry, which would see later remasters and re-envisionings on future consoles with the PlayStation 2 and even with modern systems. As the flagship fighting game for the Sega Saturn, Virtua Fighter 2 was a technical marvel. It showcased the Saturn's ability to handle 3D graphics, and its deep, complex fighting mechanics helped cement it as one of the greatest fighting games ever of its era. And even to this day, it's still often regarded as one of the greatest fighting games of all time.
Fight! 1, ready, go!
This strategic RPG is revered for its deep combat system and engaging story. Although only one part of the Shining Force 3 trilogy was released outside of Japan, it remains one of the best tactical RPGs of the 32-bit era. A top-tier shoot-em-up, Radiant Silvergun is known for its innovative gameplay, challenging difficulty and stunning visuals. Its combo-based mechanics and deep scoring system set it apart from other shooters at the time, a real hidden gem on the Saturn. Dragon Force is a unique strategy RPG that lets players command armies of hundreds of troops in real-time battles. The game's blend of tactical depth, massive scale combat, and kingdom management made it a beloved title among strategy fans. It did get an update as part of the PlayStation 2's Sega Ages collection in Japan, but the Saturn version is often still seen as the better of the two editions available. Another hidden gem on the Sega Saturn, Guardian Heroes blends beat 'em up with action and RPG elements like character leveling and branching story paths. The chaotic multiplayer mode and fluid combat made it an instant classic back in the day. Definitely one to look out for. One of the best arcade racing games of the era and possibly ever made. Sega Rally Championship was a technical showpiece for the Sega Saturn. Its tight controls, smooth handling and iconic stages made it an essential game for racing fans, influencing the future of arcade and rally simulation games from that point on. A true masterpiece. Bomberman on the Sega Saturn is often regarded as the best entry in the long-running series. Its 10-player multiplayer mode with multi-tap support made it a party favourite, while its classic gameplay remained as addictive as ever. Its 2D visuals, like many other games seen on the system, were stunning. It is definitely another title worth checking out. Developed by Sonic Team, Burning Rangers puts players in the role of futuristic firefighters. Its innovative use of 3D environments and voice navigation made it one of the most unique games on the Saturn, with a charming and heroic narrative, with many considering it to be a true hidden gem on the system that everybody should try.
その隔壁は開かないようね。近くに非常用のスイッチがあるはずよ。フラントユニットの向こう側に回って。
A near-perfect arcade port, Street Fighter Alpha 3 on the Saturn is a fantastic example of the console's ability to handle fast-paced 2D fighters. With its huge roster, refined mechanics and vibrant visuals, it's one of the best fighting games on the system and possibly ever made. While the Saturn version wasn't as visually stunning as the arcade edition, the House of the Dead remains a fun and thrilling light gun shooter. Its fast-paced zombie blasting action helped establish Sega as a leader in the genre. As a first-person dungeon crawler, Shining the Holy Ark was a visually impressive and challenging RPG. Its atmospheric dungeons, well-crafted puzzles and engaging turn-based combat made it a must-play for fans of the genre on the console, and a great addition to your game's library. Known for its intense action and stunning boss designs, Darius Gaiden is a beloved horizontal shooter that offered beautiful backgrounds and a killer soundtrack. It's still praised for its arcade quality experience, being seen as one of the best shoot 'em ups ever on the Sega Saturn. A spiritual successor to Landstalker, Dark Savior mixed platforming, puzzle solving and RPG elements with multiple story paths based on players' decisions. It's a real hidden gem that rewards exploration and replayability, a must-have for fans of the Sega Saturn and RPG games. Die Hard Arcade, also known as Dynamite Deca in Japan, would be an essential addition to the Saturn's diverse catalogue with its fast-paced action and fighting mechanics, along with quick-time events that would be seen as some of the greatest 3D beat-em-ups of the 32-bit console generation, even surpassing many entries released on the PlayStation during the time. The Saturn port is an excellent alternative to the arcade original, and it is still regarded as one of the greatest beat-em-ups ever made to this day. The game would also receive a modern update later on, which would release on the PlayStation 2, under the Sega Ages catalogue in Japan. Deep Fear would be Sega's answer to Resident Evil, with Capcom's successful horror classic exploding in popularity on the PlayStation in 1996, and it would be of no surprise to see more developers be influenced by its overall success, with the Saturn not having a massive selection of horror games available, but would bring the game to the console in 1998, making it one of the last high development budget titles to be released on the system before Sega would move their focus to the upcoming Dreamcast console that would release 1 year later. It's a solid alternative to the early Resident Evil games, but an expensive one at that, as you won't find this game cheap anywhere, with prices soaring massively over the years. These games highlight the Sega Saturn's eclectic library and its technical capabilities, even if the system struggled to keep pace with its competitors. Many of these original titles are still considered essential to retro gaming enthusiasts and collectors. The later PlayStation 2 console over the years would see a ton of Saturn ports added to the Sega Ages lineup, with most entries only ever seeing releases in Japan, making them inaccessible for many. But now with emulation, it is possible to play them. Although if you have played any of these modern versions, while tweaks have been made to improve visuals, they are still seen to be nowhere near as memorable as the original Saturn version. I personally began collecting for the Sega Saturn a few years back, as it was one of the few consoles that eluded me over the years, as I grew up with early Sega and Nintendo consoles, while in my teens and 20s played mainly on the PlayStation consoles. But the allure of the Saturn was all too appealing, so I managed to get my hands on one and bought a few accessories to allow for playing games from other regions, which is a must if you want to collect more games for the system. But over the years, the prices of most games have skyrocketed, making them out of reach for many, with costs being over 10 times their original retail value, with games like Deep Fear, which I spent over €90 on, which was expensive for that time, but only to explode not too soon after, with prices now being seen over €400 plus, which is totally insane. Some of the greatest games ever made can still only be found on the Sega Saturn, that you simply won't be able to find or play anywhere else. Still, it proves that the Saturn was an overlooked console, but over time, it has become one of the most beloved and adored systems ever made. The fact that it still is the best place to play 2D classics, fighters and arcade ports only adds to the console's ever-growing appeal, and if you value originality, this is the place to go. As we celebrate 30 years of the Sega Saturn, we can appreciate its unique place in gaming history. Though it didn't achieve the commercial success Sega had hoped for, it still remains a beloved system for many, cherished for its innovative design and unforgettable games. And at the end of the day, the Saturn itself contributed to the evolution of gaming, which left an indelible mark that is the perfect alternative to the Sony PlayStation, and that is something that's worth remembering. So whether you're a long-time fan or just discovering it for the first time, the Sega Saturn is definitely a console I recommend worth looking into. It has so much to offer for retro gaming fans, with even more great and interesting titles to discover that you will find interesting. But to find out more about these interesting titles, you can learn more about them in this next video that will dive further into the immersive games catalogue of the Sega Saturn.